Hey guys, tonight we journey back thousands of years before your coffee maker, before your alarm clock, before the luxury of hitting snooze and scrolling TikTok in bed. Instead, picture this: the sun creeping over the horizon, dust settling in the air, and you're waking up in a reed hut or a mud brick home. That's right, no castles, no marble villas, no comfy IKEA mattress. Just reeds, mud, and maybe a few fleas thrown in for good measure. Now, before you sigh in relief that you were born in the age of Wi-Fi, buckle up, because while history books love to glamorize pyramids, ziggurats, and mighty empires, daily life for the majority was far less shiny. It was gritty, it was itchy, and it smelled a little funky. Tonight, we're going to strip away the grand myths and step barefoot onto the packed dirt floor of a home built not for kings or priests, but for you, the regular person who had to live, sweat, and somehow survive in these structures. So dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and imagine yourself waking up not in your air-conditioned room, but in a small, dark hut where the walls literally sweat mud when it rains. Oh, and don't forget to hit like and subscribe while you're at it, because trust me, after this journey, you'll be grateful you're watching from the comfort of the 21st century. And hey, drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is right now. It's always fun to see who's tuning in from midnight in Melbourne or lunch break in London. All right, let's step inside. You stir awake as the first rays of sun slant through a gap in the wall. There's no window glass here, just an opening stuffed with reeds, maybe a rag if you're fancy. The floor is hard-packed dirt. You slept either on a mat of woven reeds or, if you're lucky, a simple raised platform covered with straw. Comfort? Not really. You shift and scratch. Fleas, lice, or maybe just the itchy straw poking your back. That's your alarm clock. And before you even think about breakfast, let's talk about the smell. It's a mix of smoke from last night's fire, damp reed matting, maybe some leftover fish drying in the corner, and, oh yes, the family goat tied near the doorway. Congratulations, you're living in an olfactory cocktail of survival. No scented candles, no Febreze, just raw reality. But hey, at least you're not alone. Most households were crowded. Privacy? Forget it. If you lived in Mesopotamia, Egypt, or along the Nile, your mud brick home might host your parents, siblings, maybe a cousin or two, and all the animals that couldn't survive outside overnight. Chickens, goats, sheep. Welcome to the world's first shared Airbnb, minus the reviews. Now, why mud brick or reeds? Simple. It's what you had. Stone was expensive, reserved for temples, palaces, and monuments that scream, "We're important." But you got mud. Clay mixed with straw, shaped and left to bake in the sun. Or reeds cut from the riverbank, tied together and stacked into walls. Cheap, effective, and, well, temporary. Because here's the kicker, these houses didn't last. One flood, one bad season of rain, and your home could melt back into the earth. Archaeologists love to remind us that the homes of ordinary people are the least likely to survive in the record.
Why? Because mud bricks crumble. So, ironically, the world remembers the tombs of kings better than the kitchens of the people who built them.
So, what's your morning routine in this setup? Spoiler alert, no shower, no toothpaste. You roll up your mat, shoo away a chicken from your bowl, and maybe splash some water on your face, if there's a jar of it nearby. Hygiene wasn't exactly trending. If you're by the Nile or the Euphrates, you might wander to the river to rinse off, but good luck avoiding parasites. Meanwhile, your kids are already awake and screaming because hunger is louder than any rooster. Breakfast is simple: flatbread, maybe porridge, maybe a date or fig if you're lucky. No eggs Benedict, no avocado toast. Just carbs to fuel you through a day of labor that will sweat the bread right back out of you. And as you sit there, chewing on something dry, the sun climbs higher, reminding you that your hut is about to turn into an oven. Mud walls are decent insulators, but once the heat builds, you'll want to be outside anyway, working the fields, hauling water, grinding grain, or weaving reeds. And that's the catch. Home wasn't a cozy retreat. It was a pit stop, a place to sleep, to eat, to store things, and to try not to suffocate when the smoke from your fire refused to rise out the ceiling hole.
But hold on, let's zoom out for a second. Imagine looking down at a village from above. Dozens of small rectangular mud brick houses crammed together, flat roofs doubling as sleeping platforms when nights got too hot. Narrow lanes winding between them, kids darting in and out, dogs scavenging for scraps. The whole place looks like a sand-colored Lego set built by a kid with shaky hands. And that's where your day begins, in the cramped, smoky, noisy heart of everyday survival.
So, you've woken up, you've chewed through your flatbread that tastes like it's been seasoned with dust, and now it's time to step outside. The village is already buzzing. Remember, when the sun's up, the day doesn't politely wait for you to get your bearings. You move or you starve. That simple. Step out of your mud brick doorway, and what greets you? A narrow street, more like an alleyway. No sidewalks, no cobblestones, just packed dirt riddled with ruts, footprints, and the occasional gift from someone's goat. Children run half naked, kicking a ball of bundled reeds. Women are bent over, balancing jars on their heads, heading straight for the well or riverbank. Men, they're stretching their backs, grabbing tools, and preparing for the kind of daily grind that makes your office cubicle look like paradise. Speaking of tools, let's talk about those. Your neighbors are carrying wooden plows, stone hoes, baskets woven from reeds. Iron and bronze, that's military grade or elite level stuff. For the commoner, it's wood, bone, or stone. And if it breaks, guess what? You don't run to Home Depot. You fix it yourself, or you limp through the day hoping it holds together. But before anyone gets too deep into the fields, there's a critical first stop: water. And let's not romanticize this. Fetching water wasn't some Instagram-worthy stroll with a clay jar under golden sunlight. It was labor, heavy, monotonous, back-breaking labor. A full jar could weigh 30 pounds, and most families needed multiple loads every single day. Your shoulders sore, your feet covered in mud, and your hands calloused from gripping the rope or balancing the jar. Now, you might be thinking, fine, I'll just drink straight from the river. Ha! Go ahead and let me know how that parasite-infested stomach cramp feels in about 2 days. Ancient rivers were the highways of life. Sure, they gave water and fish, but they also carried waste, dead animals, and the occasional dumped offering. Spoiler, that sparkling water wasn't so sparkling.
And speaking of waste, let's address the elephant, or rather, the human in the room. Where did people go to the bathroom? No flush toilets, no septic tanks, no public restrooms. In many mud brick villages, waste disposal was primitive at best, sewage systems. But your humble reed hut neighborhood? You're either squatting outside or hoping the goats don't chew up your private corner. The smell? Let's just say Febreze still hasn't been invented. Now, as you balance that jar of water back home, let's take a second to talk about clothing. Don't imagine flowing robes embroidered with gold. That's Hollywood royalty nonsense. You're in simple linen or wool, maybe a tunic if you're lucky. In hotter climates like Egypt, men often wore just a wraparound kilt and women a plain sheath dress. Nothing fancy, nothing comfy by modern standards. But hey, it kept you decent. Laundry day? That meant hauling everything back to the river, beating the cloth against stones, and hoping you could scrub out the sweat stains.
And oh, the sweat. Because now that the sun's really climbing, the fields call. Your stomach's grumbling, but that doesn't matter. Grain doesn't plant itself. Someone's got to pull the plow, sow the seeds, clear the weeds, or swing the sickle. It's repetitive, grueling, and endless. Think your 9 to 5 is boring? Try a 5 to 9 in the fields with 0 podcasts to keep you entertained. Of course, not everyone worked a land in exactly the same way. Maybe you're a fisherman, paddling a dugout canoe into the river, casting nets, and praying you don't get tangled. Maybe you're a potter, sitting at a crude wheel, spinning out rough bowls and jars, your hands permanently stained with clay. Or maybe you're tasked with grinding grain all day. That's right, kneeling over a stone quern, pushing another heavy stone back and forth until your arms scream. Historians estimate women spent hours every single day just grinding flour. Next time you dump bread into a toaster, remember, that's a miracle compared to their ordeal.
And don't even think about lunch being some kind of break. Midday meant pausing long enough to chew another piece of flatbread, maybe dip it in oil or eat it with onions. Protein? Rare. Meat was a festival luxury, not a Tuesday snack. More often than not, you'd fuel yourself on carbs and hope the bread kept you going. And if you lived near the river, dried fish was common, salty, chewy, and definitely not Michelin-starred. Now let's zoom back to the village for a moment. While the adults are laboring, what about the kids? No, they're not in school learning their ABCs. Only a privileged few, usually boys from wealthier families, ever saw scribal training or temple schools. For the majority, education was hands-on. You learned how to fish by fishing. You learned how to farm by following your father into the fields. By age 6 or 7, you were already contributing, fetching water, herding goats, or weaving reeds. Childhood wasn't a time for cartoons. It was apprenticeship in survival.
And then, of course, comes the noise of the village itself. Dogs barking, roosters crowing, goats bleating, babies crying. You want peace and quiet? Too bad. Every corner of the community had life spilling out of it. And unlike modern suburbs, there were no zoning laws. Workshops, kitchens, sleeping spaces, all mashed together in a chaotic mix. Sparks from a potter's kiln could drift right into your reed roof. Cozy, right? Still, there was a kind of rhythm to it all. Everyone moved in sync, driven by the cycle of sun and season. No one needed a planner app to organize their day. The fields, the animals, and the river dictated everything. If the floodwaters rose, well, you celebrated. If they failed, you panicked. Your mud brick home was more than a shelter. It was a fragile lifeline against a world that didn't care if you lived or died.
And that's just your morning. By the time the sun reaches its peak, your body's drenched in sweat, your back aches, and you're already looking forward to the only thing that might break the monotony, the gossip waiting back home. But don't relax yet. We've still got a long way to go before nightfall.
So, the sun's burning overhead, your shirt, if you even have one, is sticking to your back, and every muscle in your body is begging for mercy. Welcome to midday. In the modern world, this would be the time you slip away for an iced latte or maybe hide in an air-conditioned office break room. But here, the closest thing you're getting to downtime is a shaded corner of your mud brick house where the heat still manages to cling like an annoying relative who doesn't take the hint. You drag yourself home, shoulders sore from hauling water or swinging tools, and there, in the shadowy interior of your hut, your family is already busy. Forget the concept of one person cooking while everyone else relaxes. In these households, food prep was practically a full-time gig. Someone's kneeling on the floor, grinding grain into flour. Someone else is stoking a small clay oven or tending a fire pit. And the smell? Equal parts smoke, bread, and sweat. Delicious, right?
Let's talk about that grinding stone again, because it wasn't just a chore, it was a workout. Imagine pushing a heavy upper stone across a lower slab, back and forth for hours. Your arms burn, your knees ache, and the flour still comes out coarse enough to feel like sand in your teeth. And yes, people's teeth back then were wrecked. All that grit wore enamel down like sandpaper. By the time you hit middle age, your mouth was basically a dental graveyard. But hey, flour means bread, and bread means life. That rough, flat bread was the cornerstone of survival, the edible backbone of civilizations. Without it, you'd have nothing but an empty stomach and a lot of complaining children. Bread wasn't glamorous, but it was dependable until the harvest failed. Then you were gnawing on whatever you could find, from dried legumes to, if things got desperate, reeds and weeds that barely counted as food. Of course, bread wasn't the only thing on the menu. If you were near water, you might supplement with fish. Not the flaky, buttery salmon fillet you're picturing. Think small, bony fish, dried in the sun, then eaten chewy and salty. If you were lucky, you had some lentils or beans. And maybe, just maybe, a drizzle of oil to soften the crust of your bread. Meat? Don't even dream about it. Unless there was a festival, a sacrifice, or your goat conveniently keeled over, meat was a rare treat. And speaking of goats, yeah, they weren't just walking milk dispensers. Goat's milk could be turned into crude cheese or yogurt, giving your diet a little more variety. But you had to fight flies, dirt, and heat to keep it from spoiling. Ancient refrigeration, a shady corner, and a prayer.
Now, let's not pretend cooking was glamorous. Firewood had to be gathered. Fires had to be kept alive in small clay ovens or simple hearths. Smoke clung to everything. Your walls turned black, your lungs wheezed, and your eyes stung. Imagine cooking dinner every single day in what amounts to a smoky cave. Romantic, isn't it? And here's another thing. Downtime wasn't downtime. Even when you weren't grinding grain or hauling water, you were patching walls, weaving mats, repairing baskets, or trying to keep animals from eating your food supply. Your mud brick home constantly demanded attention. Cracks formed, walls crumbled, and roofs leaked. Rainstorms were your worst enemy. What do you do when your literal house starts dissolving? Answer: you patch it with more mud. Maintenance wasn't a weekend project. It was endless. Kids, of course, weren't exempt. While you're scraping soot off the walls or twisting reeds into rope, your children are right there, weaving smaller mats, carrying bundles of sticks, or chasing goats out of the kitchen area. Childhood wasn't about carefree play. It was about becoming useful as quickly as possible. Now, you might think, okay, at least they got a break in the middle of the day, right? Sort of. In hotter climates, yes, work slowed down during the blazing hours of noon. But slowed down didn't mean stopped. If you weren't in the fields, you were inside, sweating just as much over house chores. You didn't lie down for a Netflix binge. You patched a reed mat, stirred a pot, or repaired tools. Rest was active. And let's not forget the community factor. Villages were small, houses packed together, so even when you ducked inside to escape the heat, you heard your neighbors, the clatter of pots, the cries of babies, the shouts of arguments spilling through thin mud brick walls. Privacy was a modern invention. In this world, everyone's business was everyone's business. If your goat got loose, 5 households knew before you did. If your fire smoked too much, the whole lane coughed with you. By mid-afternoon, the rhythm picked up again. The sun dipped just enough to let people head back out to finish field work. Tools were hoisted, baskets filled, nets cast, and animals driven toward grazing patches. No one wanted to waste daylight, because daylight meant productivity, and productivity meant survival. You couldn't bank on tomorrow. Crops failed, floods came, pests devoured. You worked while you could. And through it all, your little mud brick or reed home sat there, enduring, crude, fragile, unimpressive, but utterly essential. It didn't need to be beautiful. It just needed to keep the wind out, the rain off, and give you a space to collapse at the end of the day. It was the bare minimum. But the bare minimum was what kept you alive. By now, the afternoon shadows are stretching, the air cooling just slightly, and your belly rumbling again. But don't get too comfortable. The evening has its own set of challenges waiting. The sun is sinking, shadows stretching long across the dirt lanes, and for a moment you think, finally, maybe I can relax? Ha! Nice try. Evening in a reed hut or mud brick home wasn't a candlelit scene of relaxation. It was the busiest, loudest, smokiest, most chaotic part of the day. First off, let's deal with dinner. Remember that smoky hearth inside your one-room house? By now, it's been stoked back to life, and the air is thick. You're coughing, blinking, waving your hands to push smoke away from your face, but it doesn't matter. The fire is stubborn, and the food still has to be cooked. Clay pots bubble with lentil stew or boil water for porridge. A slab of bread bakes against the hot walls of the clay oven, turning hard and crusty. If you're lucky, a neighbor came by with a handful of onions or herbs to add flavor. If you're unlucky, it's just the same gritty flatbread you had this morning, slightly warmed up so it feels new. And don't picture everyone sitting down at a neat table with wooden chairs. Tables, those were luxuries. Most families ate cross-legged on mats laid out on the dirt floor, passing around whatever dishes they had. Clay bowls, reed baskets, sometimes just hands. One pot might serve the entire family, with everyone dipping their bread into the same stew. Hygiene was not the headline of the night. Now, here's where the social side of the mud brick neighborhood kicks in. Evenings weren't solitary affairs. People wandered in and out of each other's homes, gossiping, trading food, sharing news about the fields or the river. You hear laughter mixed with arguing, kids chasing each other in the dust, dogs barking at scraps. Your walls were thin, and honestly, they may as well not exist. The whole village's soundtrack was your soundtrack. Oh, and let's not forget the insects. Once the sun dipped, mosquitoes came out in swarms, especially near rivers or marshlands. You swatted, cursed, and pulled a ragged cloth over yourself, but they still bit through. Forget bug spray. Forget mosquito nets. Your night was guaranteed to itch. While the family gathered, work didn't actually stop. This was prime time for weaving reeds into mats or baskets, repairing tools by firelight, or spinning thread. Imagine sitting in a smoky hut after 12 hours of labor, still using your hands to twist fibers into rope while your eyes burn from smoke and your ears ring with crying children. Yeah, rest was a flexible concept. And yet somehow, there was a sense of community and rhythm to it.
Songs drifted through the air. Little chants people used while working or putting children to sleep. Stories were told, oral traditions that carried history, myths, and family gossip all rolled into one. You didn't scroll TikTok to unwind. You listened to your uncle retell the same half-exaggerated tale about a crocodile he supposedly fought in the river, and you pretended to believe him. Now, lighting. Unless the moon was out, evenings were dark. Sure, oil lamps existed, but oil wasn't free. Every drop mattered. Most families relied on firelight, flickering, uneven, and smoky. You couldn't flood the room with brightness. You got a dim glow that left corners in shadow, perfect for rats to dart across unnoticed. And yes, there were rats. Homes stored grain, and where there was grain, there were rodents. Cats were treasured in some cultures, not just as pets, but as pest control units. If you were lucky, your mud brick home had one of these little four-legged exterminators. If not, your food storage was a free buffet. Speaking of storage, that was a constant anxiety. Your entire year's survival often depended on jars of grain tucked into a corner or buried in the floor. One crack in the jar, one infestation, and suddenly your winter prospects looked grim. Families guarded their stores like gold, which makes sense because it was their gold. Without it, no bread. Without bread, no tomorrow.
Evenings also highlighted the thin line between cooperation and tension. Living on top of each other in cramped huts meant arguments were inevitable. Who didn't fetch enough water? Who let the goat wander off? Who ate more than their share of bread? These weren't just family squabbles, they were survival disputes. In a world where every crumb counted, fairness mattered, and tempers flared easily. Now let's step outside again. The air has cooled slightly, the dust settled, and villagers gather in little knots. Maybe a drumbeat echoes somewhere, or someone's clapping a rhythm, while others sing along. Community bonds weren't just nice, they were necessary. You traded, borrowed, helped raise walls and shared tools. Alone, you'd struggle. Together, you at least stood a fighting chance against nature's indifference. By the time the sky turns black, the village quiets, sort of. Dogs bark in the distance, owls hoot, and insects hum endlessly. Inside your hut, you unroll the same reed mat or spread out straw on the floor. Families slept close, often side by side, because warmth was survival. In hotter climates, people climbed up onto their flat mud brick roofs to sleep under the stars, hoping for a breeze to cool the sweat. Romantic? Only until you realize the roof was hard as stone and crawling with beetles. And just before sleep pulls you under, you hear it, the creak of your own walls. Mud settling, reeds shifting, the ever-present reminder that your home is temporary, fragile, and always on the brink of crumbling. Tomorrow, you'll wake up to the same routine, the same struggle, the same fight to wrestle survival out of mud and sweat. But for now, you close your eyes, scratch at the mosquito bites, and drift into uneasy rest.
So, the village has settled into that restless half-silence. People are lying on mats or stretched across flat roofs, and the night air is heavy with the smell of smoke, sweat, and the faint sweetness of drying reeds.
But don't think for a second that night meant safety. If anything, night was when your reed hut or mud brick home proved just how flimsy it really was. First off, animals. Not the cute, cuddly kind. We're talking snakes slithering in through gaps in the wall, scorpions finding cozy corners near your sleeping mat, and rats bold enough to nibble on your stored grain while you're trying to sleep. Imagine waking up to a rustle, rolling over, and realizing it's not your kid shifting in the dark. It's a snake coiled near the fire pit. Sleep tight. And then there were the larger animals outside. Dogs roamed villages, sometimes protective, sometimes feral. Jackals or wolves circled at the edges, sniffing for scraps. If you were near the Nile or Mesopotamian marshes, crocodiles and hippos were a constant threat near waterways. Yes, hippos, those adorable fat river cows. They were among the deadliest creatures around, and you did not want one wandering into your fields at night.
As if that weren't enough, there were the human dangers. Mud brick villages weren't fortified fortresses. A determined thief, raider, or desperate neighbor could push through a reed wall or break a weak door without much effort. Theft wasn't rare, especially when one family's grain jar looked fuller than another's. In lean seasons, envy turned into action, and neighbors became threats. Entire communities relied on mutual trust, but desperation had a way of testing that trust quickly. So how did people defend themselves? Well, let's just say your home security system wasn't exactly high-tech. Some households had dogs as alarm systems. Others relied on locking doors with simple wooden bars or piling heavy stones across entrances. Villages might organize night watches, with men taking turns to patrol the outskirts. But most of the time, you went to sleep hoping the darkness itself would be enough to keep danger at bay. Spoiler, it often wasn't.
Now, let's talk about the structure of night itself. Unlike us, glued to phones, pulling all-nighters, and running on caffeine, ancient people followed a different rhythm. Sleep often came in 2 shifts. Historians call it first sleep and second sleep. People would doze off after sundown, sleep for a few hours, then wake in the middle of the night. What did they do with that time? Well, some prayed, some whispered stories, some tended fires or checked animals. Then, after an hour or 2, they'd drift back into their second sleep until dawn. Imagine waking up at 2 a.m. to patch a crack in your wall or chase a goat back into the pen. That was normal, and don't forget the weather factor. In summer, nights could be sweltering even indoors, forcing people onto rooftops or courtyards. In winter, those same mud brick walls turned into ice boxes, and you'd huddle under reed mats or wool blankets, pressed against family members for warmth. Comfort wasn't a goal. Survival was.
Of course,
The night also carried a thick layer of superstition. Darkness was dangerous, not just physically, but spiritually. Every culture had its own fears. Evil spirits lurked in the shadows. Ghosts wandered between huts. Witches, demons, restless ancestors, all part of the nighttime imagination. And let's be real, when your only light is a flickering fire or a weak oil lamp, every shadow looks like something ready to snatch you away. Those eerie creaks of mud settling, clearly a spirit poking around your house. That rustle by the storage jar, definitely not a rat. It's a demon trying to steal your grain. Good luck convincing yourself otherwise in total darkness. So what did people do? Amulets, charms, prayers. Mothers tied protective symbols onto their children. Men muttered incantations before lying down. Temples sold little clay figurines meant to guard against spirits. And of course, stories reinforced the fear. Stay inside after dark, or the river spirit will take you. Fear wasn't just cultural, it was practical, because going out after dark meant you risked stumbling into predators, raiders, or the river itself. Better to believe in monsters and stay indoors than test the very real dangers outside.
Meanwhile, inside your hut, the air was anything but fresh. With fires smoldering and bodies packed close, the room grew hot, smoky, and suffocating. Children tossed, goats bleated, someone coughed endlessly from smoke inhalation, and outside, mosquitoes whined like a never-ending alarm clock. Peaceful sleep? Forget it. Nights were long, restless, and punctuated by interruptions, human, animal, or spiritual. And yet, this was normal. People adapted. They learned to sleep light, to jolt awake at every noise, to keep a stick nearby for fending off rats or snakes. Survival meant making peace with discomfort, because what else could you do? Mud brick walls weren't miracle barriers. They were just another layer between you and the chaos of the outside world. By the time the horizon begins to pale and roosters crow again, you're not exactly rested. You're stiff, itchy, maybe still hungry. But the cycle restarts. The same walls, the same reed mats, the same smoke-filled air. Your home wasn't a sanctuary. It was a thin, fragile pause in a constant struggle for survival. The rooster's crow cuts through the stale air, and before the sun is fully awake, so are you. And here's the thing, depending on the season, your day-to-day life inside that fragile home could look wildly different. The mud brick box you slept in wasn't just a shelter. It was a barometer of the year, amplifying every change in climate, flood, and ritual. Take summer, for example.
The heat wasn't just uncomfortable, it was suffocating. Mud brick walls soaked in sunlight all day, then radiated it back like a slow-cooking oven. Families often abandoned the inside entirely, shifting cooking, sleeping, and even some storage to rooftops or courtyards. Picture climbing up your rickety mud brick stairs, laying mats across a flat roof, and praying a nighttime breeze saved you from boiling alive. Of course, that meant you were also a mosquito buffet, and one slip away from rolling off the edge in your sleep. Luxury.
Winter flipped the script. Suddenly, those same walls turned into damp, cold sponges. Reed mats stiffened with frost. Smoke from the fire clung thicker to the ceiling, and everyone piled together under coarse wool blankets or reed covers. Children coughed, joints ached, and damp crept in through cracks. Firewood was precious, so you rationed heat carefully. Too much smoke and your lungs burned. Too little and your fingers went numb. Survival was a balancing act. And then there was the rainy season. Imagine it. A downpour hammers your village, and instead of hearing the comforting patter on a roof, you hear the squelch of walls starting to dissolve. Mud brick houses absorbed water like sponges. Roofs leaked, walls bulged, and in extreme cases, entire structures sagged back into the earth. Families scrambled with baskets of mud, patching walls mid-storm, praying the whole thing didn't collapse. Archaeologists today find layers of melted brick, entire neighborhoods that literally returned to mud overnight. That was your reality. Your house was only as good as the weather allowed. But it wasn't all misery. The home was also a hub of ritual, belief, and seasonal rhythm. Let's start with festivals. Agriculture was tied to the heavens, floods, rains, harvests, and when the cycle turned in your favor, you celebrated. And where did those celebrations begin? Inside the household. Families offered the first loaf of new bread or the first jug of beer to household gods. Shrines weren't marble temples. They were little clay niches tucked into the corner of a mud brick wall, where offerings of breadcrumbs, oil, or even flowers were placed. Religion didn't live only in temples or ziggurats. It lived in the daily grind of your home. Amulets hung from reed mats to ward off sickness. Figurines of protective spirits sat near the doorway. Mothers whispered charms as they laid babies down to sleep. And every crack in the wall, every shadow in the corner could hold spiritual meaning. Your mud brick house wasn't just a shelter. It was a fragile fortress against both natural and supernatural chaos. Now, festivals themselves were a break in the monotony. Picture this. After months of endless bread and sweat, the whole community gathers. Drums beat, songs rise, and yes, finally, meat hits the table. Goats or cattle sacrificed to gods meant fresh roasted flesh for ordinary bellies. For once, your hut smells like something other than smoke and onions. Neighbors laugh, dance, drink beer brewed from barley, and for a fleeting night, the mud brick walls feel less like a prison and more like a backdrop to joy. Of course, when the hangover wore off, reality returned. Because your home wasn't just shaped by seasons and rituals, it was tied to labor cycles too. Harvest season turned the house into a storage depot, every jar and corner stuffed with grain. Planting season transformed it into a tool shop, baskets and plows stacked against the walls. During floods, families huddled together, waiting, hoping the waters left enough fertile soil to feed them the next year. The building itself seemed to breathe with the seasons, swelling and shrinking with every shift in the calendar. Let's not skip over ritual purity either. Many cultures tied cleanliness, or the lack of it, to religion. Sure, your mud brick floor was a patchwork of dirt, ash, and goat droppings, but when a baby was born or someone died, suddenly rules kicked in. Floors were swept, mats burned, charms hung, water sprinkled. Homes became sacred spaces in moments of crisis or transition. Your humble hut, sagging and cracked, doubled as a stage for the most important passages of life.
And then there's the psychological side. Think about it. When every storm threatens your walls, when every flood decides your crop, when every cough might be deadly, you cling to ritual like a lifeline. Lighting a lamp at dusk, smearing mud across a crack with whispered words, leaving crumbs for a household god, these weren't quaint traditions. They were survival strategies. They gave shape to chaos, comfort to fear. By late afternoon, as shadows lengthen again, you're reminded your house is never just your house. It's part of a living cycle. It absorbs the heat, the damp, the smoke, the voices, the prayers. It weathers seasons, floods, plagues, births, and deaths. It's temporary, yes, but in its fragile mud and reed walls, entire generations lived, sweated, and believed. And as evening rolls back around, you realize tomorrow the cycle repeats, but with every season, every ritual, every repair, the story of survival grows thicker in those crumbling walls.
Inside those mud brick walls, life wasn't a free-for-all. Every person, from toddlers to elders, had their slot in the machinery of survival. And while modern folks might argue about work-life balance, in your world, there was no balance, just duty. The house wasn't just four walls, it was a hive of labor, with roles carved out by gender, age, and sheer necessity. Let's start with women. In many of these early agrarian societies, women bore the brunt of the domestic cycle. And don't let that sound like some quiet, leisurely domestic bliss. It was backbreaking. Picture kneeling on a mat for hours, grinding grain on a stone quern, your arms and shoulders screaming from the repetition. This wasn't optional. Bread was life, and every loaf started with that grinding. Add cooking, weaving reed mats, brewing beer, fetching water, mending clothes, and tending the kids, and suddenly the housewife label feels like a cruel joke. And then there was childbirth. No hospitals, no epidurals, no sterile equipment, just women supporting women. Midwives, often neighbors with experience, showed up when labor began. Babies were delivered onto reed mats, and the outcome was terrifyingly uncertain. Infant mortality rates were sky high. and mothers weren't much safer. Yet the community kept going because they had no choice. Birth wasn't just a family affair, it was survival for the whole settlement. Every new child meant another set of hands for the endless work.
Now, men. Their labor stretched beyond the walls. Farming, irrigation, hauling, fishing, herding, it was their daily grind. But make no mistake, their absence didn't mean they were off having fun. Long hours in fields meant returning home sunburned, dehydrated, and sore. Mud brick homes became places of brief refuge, not relaxation. Imagine stumbling back inside after a day in a blazing field, only to face the smoky interior where your meal was waiting. That meal existed because someone else inside the hut had slaved away to make sure it did. Survival was a partnership, though rarely an equal one. Children, they weren't pampered, and childhood wasn't some golden age of play. As soon as little arms and legs could carry weight, they worked. Toddlers scared chickens out of grain stores. Older kids fetched water, collected reeds, or herded goats. And yes, they still played, but play often blurred into training, throwing clay balls that mimicked sling stones, chasing goats as practice for real herding. By the time you were 10, you weren't a child anymore. You were a contributor. And then, elders. In societies where life expectancy was brutally short, anyone past 40 was practically ancient. But if you made it that far, you weren't useless. Older women passed on brewing techniques, weaving skills, and herbal remedies. Men offered advice, remembered flood patterns, and knew which fields failed or thrived decades earlier. Oral history lived inside these frail bodies. A cracked mud home without elders wasn't just missing grandparents, it was missing memory itself.
So, where did all this happen? Inside those tiny, suffocating homes, every role collided. Imagine the chaos. A woman grinding grain, kids chasing each other underfoot, a baby crying, an elder mumbling a prayer, and smoke filling the air. Privacy? Forget it. Gender roles, family roles, all blurred together in the cramped quarters. But blurred doesn't mean erased. Rules were enforced, loudly. Step out of line, fail your duty, and everyone noticed. And let's be real, these homes weren't peaceful havens of familial love. Quarrels erupted, space was tight, resources tighter, tempers short. Archaeological digs even reveal signs of domestic violence, broken bones, injuries consistent with beatings. The mud brick walls that heard lullabies also absorbed screams. The family was the core unit of survival, but that didn't mean it was gentle. Still, cooperation was unavoidable. You didn't survive alone, and you didn't get to choose whether to pitch in. If you wanted to eat, if you wanted a roof over your head, you worked. Your mud brick or reed home wasn't just a shelter. It was an economic engine powered by everybody inside. And here's the twist. Those rigid roles also shaped identity. A boy's first time herding goats was a rite of passage. A girl weaving her first mat marked her shift toward adulthood. Daily chores weren't just labor.
They were identity markers, social proof that you were pulling your weight. And the walls of those huts bore silent witness to countless initiations into the world of responsibility. So, when you step back and look at that cramped, smoky interior, what you see isn't just home, it's a machine of survival, a training ground, a theater of family drama, and a shrine of continuity. Roles weren't just about survival, they defined who you were, who you could be, and how the entire fragile structure of society kept limping forward.
You're hungry, but before you picture a steaming feast, let's reset expectations. Dinner inside a mud brick or reed home was not a glamorous banquet. It was survival on a plate. Or more often, survival in a clay bowl. Meals weren't about variety or indulgence. They were about getting enough fuel to drag yourself through the next round of labor. Bread was the cornerstone, not the soft, fluffy loaves you find at a bakery today. Think dense, heavy, coarse lumps of barley or emmer wheat, baked flat on hot stones or plastered against the inner wall of a clay oven. Each bite carried grit from stone-ground flour, grinding your teeth down like sandpaper. Archaeologists literally find ancient skulls with jaws worn smooth from years of chewing this abrasive bread. Forget braces. You'd be lucky to have teeth left by middle age. Beer followed close behind. And no, not the chilled golden stuff with foamy heads you grab from a fridge. Ancient beer was more like thick, fermented porridge, tangy, sour, sometimes chunky. You didn't sip it elegantly, you slurped it through straws to filter out the floating husks. But it was safer than water, packed calories, and yes, gave you a little buzz. In a world of endless toil, that slight buzz was probably the highlight of the day. Meals were communal. Picture the whole family gathered on the floor, no tables, no chairs, just mats or bare dirt. Food went into shared bowls, and everyone reached in. Hygiene? Not exactly priority number one. Greasy fingers, grubby hands from herding or grinding, all dunking into the same pot. Today, we'd call it unsanitary. Back then, it was normal.
And the spread? Don't imagine spice racks or seasoning variety. Onions, garlic, leeks, lentils, chickpeas, these were staples, boiled into stews with whatever grain or scrap of fish or goat you had. Salt was a treasure if you could get it. Herbs came and went with the seasons. Most days, the taste was bland, repetitive, and heavy. Food wasn't meant to dazzle your palate. It was meant to keep your body moving. But, and here's the kicker, when ritual or fortune allowed, the table transformed. Festivals, sacrifices, or rare windfalls meant meat. Roasted goat, grilled fish, or even cattle if the gods and the harvest smiled. The smell of sizzling fat was intoxicating in a world where most protein came from legumes. For one night, your home filled with the fragrance of luxury, and for once, your stomach stretched past just enough. Even hunger itself had a rhythm. Times of abundance, post-harvest or festival, meant your jars and bins bulged. But famine lurked constantly. A poor flood season, locusts,
or disease in the fields, and suddenly your meals shrank to scraps. Kids went hungry first. Adults rationed what little remained. And in desperate times, meals meant for people might be shared with livestock, or vice versa. The line between what's food and what's desperation blurred quickly. Mealtime wasn't just about calories, though. It was about ritual. The first bread might be crumbled onto a small household altar, a sip of beer poured onto the dirt for spirits. Eating wasn't just eating. It was a transaction with the unseen. Every bite could carry a whispered prayer, every cup a plea for health or good floods. Inside those cramped walls, mealtime doubled as religious performance. And let's not forget the politics of the household bowl. Who ate first? Often the men who did field work. Who got the scraps? Children or the elderly? Women who cooked didn't always serve themselves first. Power wasn't just outside in temples or palaces. It played out over stew pots inside the humblest huts. Hunger made hierarchy visible. Still, mealtime wasn't entirely grim. It was one of the few daily pauses when everyone gathered. Laughter, chatter, even singing filled the smoky space. Kids begged for second scoops, mothers scolded, elders told stories while chewing slowly. Food bound the family together. Even if the bread was hard, even if the stew was thin, the act of gathering mattered as much as the meal itself. So, picture it. Dim light, bowls of thick stew, the sour-sweet tang of beer in the air, the crackle of a reed fire, and bodies huddled close around the meal. In that moment, the mud brick home transformed. Not glamorous, not abundant, but alive with the rhythm of survival and the stubborn will to keep going. Let's be blunt. Your house stank. There's no polite way to put it. When you cram people, animals, smoke, sweat, and stew into 4 walls made of mud and reeds, you don't get cozy cottage vibes. You get a nose-watering cocktail of odors that never really goes away. Start with waste. Toilets, as you imagined them, didn't exist for most households. Some cultures dug small pits near the house. Others used clay jars or buckets. Many just walked outside, squatted near a field, or went behind the house. And because soap wasn't a thing and running water didn't exist, hands went unwashed more often than not. That stew you're sharing? Yeah, it's probably spiced with bacteria. Inside the home, smoke hung heavy. Fires burned for cooking and warmth, and ventilation was terrible. Roof holes, if they existed, only did so much. Imagine your lungs sucking in ash and fumes every single day. Chronic coughing, red eyes, and blackened walls were the price of every meal. Modern doctors would call it respiratory disease. Back then, you just called it life. Then there were the bugs. Fleas, lice, bed bugs, take your pick. Sleeping on reed mats or animal skins meant you were never alone at night. They burrowed in, bit constantly, spread disease, and made rest a joke. Add to that mosquitoes swarming around mud brick villages near rivers or floodplains, and suddenly malaria wasn't some exotic disease, it was the nightly lottery you kept losing.
Water, the supposed source of life, was a gamble too. Fetching it from rivers or canals meant scooping up not just liquid, but whatever floated in it. Dirt, animal droppings, parasites. Boiling wasn't always practical, so people drank what they had, and stomach cramps or dysentery followed. You learned quickly that drinking water could kill you just as easily as thirst. Which is why beer or weak fermented drinks became staples. They were safer, even if they left you tipsy at noon. And don't forget the animals. Chickens, goats, maybe a donkey or cow, they often shared space with you, especially at night. Cozy, right? Until you realize the floor is smeared with droppings, fleas bounce between species, and diseases jump right across the animal-human divide. Zoonotic illness wasn't a science term. It was your daily risk.
Now, think about medicine. What did you do when sickness hit? No pharmacies, no sterile bandages, no antibiotics. Instead, you leaned on herbal knowledge, charms, and trial and error remedies. Honey on wounds, garlic in stews, clay or ash poultices. Sometimes they helped, sometimes they made things worse. And always, the house itself was the infirmary. A corner mat became the sickbed, the smoky air your hospital ward. Recovery wasn't guaranteed. Often, death was the end of the story. The smells of illness blended with everyday odors. A festering wound, a baby's diarrhea, or the sour tang of vomit became part of the household air. If you've ever smelled a damp basement mixed with wet animals, multiply that by 10 and add the stench of human sweat after 12 hours in the fields. Congratulations, you're breathing in history.
But here's the fascinating part. People adapted. You got noseblind to it. What would send a modern visitor gagging was just background noise for you. The stench of goats was reassuring. They meant milk. The acrid smoke of the hearth meant warmth and food. Even the tang of human sweat was a sign the family was alive and working. Your mud brick hut wasn't a sanitized box. It was a living organism, pulsing with bodies, smells, and bacteria. And still, rituals wrapped around cleanliness existed. Bathing in rivers, oil rubs scraped off with reeds, sweeping floors, sprinkling water to settle dust. These weren't luxuries, they were survival habits. Maybe you couldn't stay clean by modern standards, but you fought daily to keep filth from overwhelming you completely. So imagine sitting in that dim hut. The smoke stings your eyes, lice itch at your scalp, your stomach churns from questionable water, and a goat nudges you for space on the floor. It sounds miserable, right? Yet for the people who lived it, this was home. Not glamorous, not fragrant, but a space where life clung on stubbornly against all odds. Picture this. The sun's first light filters through cracks in the reed mat roof,
And before you've even rubbed the grit from your eyes, the day's demands come crashing in. Forget morning routines with stretches, coffee, or checking your phone. Your routine was survival, and survival didn't wait. Men headed straight to fields, canals, or workshops. Farming wasn't just about tossing seeds into the dirt and waiting. It was brutal labor, plowing with wooden tools, often yoked to oxen if you were lucky, or to your own body if you weren't. Irrigation ditches needed constant attention. Without modern pumps or pipes, canals were dug, patched, dredged by hand, mud caking your legs as you fought to keep water flowing. Skip a day, and your crop withered. Skip a season, and your whole family starved.
Meanwhile, women turned the home into its own workshop. Grain didn't grind itself. Water didn't appear on command. Thread didn't weave itself into cloth. Imagine kneeling for hours over a grinding stone, your back bent, muscles aching, just to turn handfuls of barley into enough flour for bread that barely filled bellies. Or weaving, tedious, repetitive, eye-straining, yet vital for clothing, mats, and ropes. Every finished thread was a victory over scarcity. And children? They weren't spectators. Kids as young as 5 were already running errands, herding goats, or scaring birds out of fields. Play was training. Chase a goat today, guard a herd tomorrow. Toss a clay ball at a sibling, and next year you're slinging stones at predators. Childhood was a crash course in labor, and the graduation exam was surviving to adulthood.
The house itself mirrored this rhythm. In the morning, it was nearly empty, echoing with the sound of chores, grinding, sweeping, fire stoking. By midday, it turned into a pit stop. Workers returned briefly to grab food or water, catch their breath in the shade, then head back out. Afternoons blurred into the same endless cycle: fields, weaving, hauling, patching, repairing. But here's the kicker: the work never truly ended. After sunset, when you'd think it was time to rest, chores kept rolling. Animals needed tending, food had to be prepped for the next day, tools mended by the flickering light of a fire. Nights weren't for Netflix or scrolling. They were for making sure tomorrow didn't collapse before it even started.
And the physical toll? It was brutal. Archaeologists studying skeletons from these communities find spines worn down by constant strain, knees ground smooth from years of squatting, shoulders deformed from endless, repetitive motion. Your body was the tool, and the house was the workshop where it was sharpened, dulled, and eventually broken. The rhythm wasn't just physical, though. It was social. The walls of your home heard the grunt of labor and the sighs of exhaustion, but they also echoed with coordination. Who's fetching water? Who's patching the roof? Who's watching the goats? Arguments flared when someone slacked. Responsibility wasn't optional. Everyone's survival depended on everyone else pulling weight.
And don't imagine weekends or vacations. Time off existed only when nature forced it. During floods, droughts, or sickness. Even then, rest meant patching walls, rethatching roofs, or fixing tools. The mud brick home wasn't a place to recharge. It was a checkpoint, a staging ground, a space where the wheels of survival turned nonstop. The irony? For all that effort, you lived constantly on the edge of disaster. One failed crop, one broken tool, one injury, and your carefully balanced routine crumbled. Every day you rose with the sun, pushed through the grind, and collapsed into smoky air at night, knowing tomorrow would demand the same. So when you think about your home in this world, don't picture a sanctuary. Picture a base camp in an unending war against time, hunger, and the elements. Mud walls weren't meant for relaxation. They were meant to shelter a workforce that had no choice but to keep moving. By the time night falls, the long, grueling day finally ends. Or at least that's what you'd hope. Step inside your mud brick hut or read home, and reality hits. Sleep was not a luxury. It was a necessity, fought for tooth and nail, often on surfaces so hard and scratchy you'd think the floor itself was conspiring against you. Most families didn't have beds as we think of them. A flat mud floor or a raised platform of woven reeds or straw doubled as mattress and stage for everything else in life. Children slept alongside parents. Adults pressed shoulder to shoulder to conserve warmth. Privacy? Forget it. Even if you managed to roll over quietly, a goat might have curled up next to you. A baby might scream, or an elder might cough and wake half the room. The mats themselves were something. Reeds, straw, animal skins, sometimes layered, sometimes not, offered minimal cushioning. You'd wake stiff, sore, and covered in sweat or the remnants of dirt from the day. Lice, fleas, and bedbugs weren't optional roommates. They were part of the furniture. By modern standards, your bedding was a disease incubator. By historical standards, it was home. Temperature was another brutal factor. In summer, the mud walls radiated heat you had absorbed all day. Even at night, the air was thick, sticky, and suffocating. Many families climbed to rooftops to sleep under the stars, mats spread over hard clay or flat mud, hoping for even the faintest breeze. Romantic? Sure, until you realize the roof was crawling with insects, and one slip could send you rolling off into the dust below. Winter, on the other hand, turned the same walls into ice blocks. Humidity crept in, mats stiffened, and the chill gnawed at fingers and toes. Families huddled together under whatever cloth or straw they could muster. Sleeping close wasn't just comfort, it was survival. Heat transfer became a life-saving skill, and every body pressed against you counted.
And yet sleep was sporadic. First sleep, second sleep. People often woke in the night, not because of luxury or boredom, but because life demanded attention. A sick child, a leaking roof, a goat squealing outside, a sudden downpour. any of these could interrupt rest. Some villagers used these wakeful hours to tend fires, repair walls, or keep watch, because darkness was full of dangers. Noise didn't help. The walls were thin, neighbors' arguments, children crying, animals squealing, all filtered into your room. You couldn't escape it, couldn't drown it out, and learned to sleep light, always half aware of potential threats. Modern insomnia? This was survival insomnia, your body trained to wake at every rustle.
The psychological load of sleeping in such conditions is easy to underestimate. Every creak of settling mud brick, every shadow cast by a flickering fire, every rustle outside became a signal. Check the animals, patch the roof, or brace for disaster. Fear and vigilance didn't disappear at night. They just layered over exhaustion. And yet, people adapted. Children learned to sleep through chaos. Adults learned to balance wakefulness with brief recovery. And families survived, day after relentless day.
Finally, there was ritual. Even the act of sleeping carried spiritual weight. Charms tucked into mats, whispered prayers, or small offerings near the sleeping area were common. Why? Because the line between life and death was thin, and people hoped even the tiniest act might keep misfortune at bay. Sleep wasn't just rest, it was a calculated gamble against chance, disease, and the unseen world. By morning, your body was sore, your clothes dirty, your hair crawling with insects, and yet you staggered upright. Why? Because the day demanded it. And so, in the same mud brick or reed home where you endured discomfort, disease, and chaos, you found the briefest reprieve possible, a chance to restore energy, even if only partially, before the grind resumed.
Children in mud brick and reed homes weren't just dependents. They were vital cogs in the relentless machinery of survival. From the moment they could crawl, the household began its unofficial training program, with lessons delivered through observation, imitation, and, yes, a fair dose of tough love. Forget classrooms, desks, or pencils. Education happened in the thick of daily life. Toddlers followed mothers to the hearth, watching grain being ground, pots being stirred, mats woven. "Don't touch that" wasn't just a warning, it was a lesson in fire safety and survival. A child who learned to kneel correctly, sweep thoroughly, or fetch water without spilling was already mastering life skills critical for the family's survival.
Older children had heavier responsibilities. Boys often shadowed fathers or male elders into fields, canals, or workshops. They learned to handle plows, maintain simple tools, herd animals, or even fish. One wrong step, one misjudged stone, and either you or your livestock could be injured. Apprenticeship wasn't optional. By age 10,
you weren't a child anymore. You were a worker in training, and your efficiency could affect the family's next meal. Girls, meanwhile, learned domestic arts, which, don't be fooled, were far from leisurely. Weaving mats, spinning thread, brewing beer, and cooking heavy meals weren't minor chores, they were essential. Girls watched mothers, mimicked gestures, and repeated tasks hundreds of times until their hands knew the rhythm. Mistakes meant wasted food, broken mats, or spoiled clothes, all of which carried social and economic consequences. In a world of scarcity, apprenticeship was survival, and precision was everything.
Play still existed, but often it doubled as training. Throwing a clay ball wasn't just fun. It honed aim and coordination for hunting or defense. Chasing chickens, practice herding skills. Running around in the courtyard, footwork and endurance for future fieldwork. Leisure was never truly separate from labor. Every game was preparation for the adult world waiting just beyond the walls. Even the smallest houses had hidden classrooms. Kitchens were workshops. Corners of mud brick huts held tools for weaving, pottery, or carpentry. Elders and parents acted as teachers, instructing children in rhythm, timing, and technique while maintaining the day's survival tasks. And since mistakes often carried real consequences, spilled grain, broken tools, or a missed task, the lessons were learned fast and hard.
Social lessons were equally important. Children observed disputes, cooperation, negotiation, and hierarchy. Sibling quarrels, chores assigned by age, and communal labor with neighbors taught social rules and survival ethics. Who spoke first at a meal? Who fetched water? Who helped repair the roof? These weren't minor lessons in etiquette. They were training for navigating a world where every action had weight. Religion and superstition were also part of this informal education. Children learned which charms protected them, which rituals soothed the household gods, and how to respect omens in daily life. Spilled water, a broken pot, or an unextinguished fire carried spiritual significance, and elders ensured these lessons were absorbed early. By adolescence, a child knew both the practical and spiritual rules for life inside a fragile, unpredictable home. Health education? Let's not get ahead of ourselves. Understanding disease wasn't science-based. Kids learned hygiene and first aid primarily through observation. Don't drink river water. Cover the wound with clay and honey. Sweep the floor to avoid lice. Trial and error was brutal, but it was how knowledge was transmitted. Survival was the teacher, and mistakes were often painfully instructive. By the time the sun set on childhood, the kids in these homes were more capable than many adults today. They could cook, weave, herd, repair, and understand the spiritual and social rules of their community. Apprenticeship inside the home didn't just produce workers, it produced resilient, resourceful human beings capable of carrying the household forward. And this, in many ways, was the genius of the mud brick and reed household. Despite the noise, the smells, the constant labor, and the relentless grind,
It was a crucible that forged the next generation. Every corner, every hearth, every worn mat contributed to a continuous cycle of skill, endurance, and knowledge. Children didn't just grow up, they were molded into survival machines, ready to face a world that expected nothing less. Inside a mud brick or reed home, the difference between life and calamity often came down to tools. And don't imagine sleek gadgets or polished metal. These were simple, functional, and sometimes brutal in their efficiency. Every household had a small arsenal of implements designed to grind, cut, build, and survive. Start with the obvious, grinding stones. These were the backbone of daily sustenance. Heavy slabs of stone, querns, transformed coarse grain into flour. And when I say heavy, I mean back-breaking. You pushed and rotated a handheld stone for hours each day, muscles screaming, joints aching. It was repetitive, exhausting, and essential. Without flour, bread disappeared. Without bread, survival wavered. Archaeologists find worn stones, still embedded with grooves, silent testimonies to thousands of hours of labor. Knives and cutting tools were ubiquitous, not decorative, not ceremonial, sharp, simple, and deadly efficient. Women used small flint or bronze knives for preparing food, slicing meat, or cutting reeds for mats. Men wielded larger blades for field work, wood cutting, or defense. A dull knife wasn't just inconvenient, it was dangerous. Every chop, scrape, or cut had to be precise. Mistakes could maim you or spoil your food. Containers mattered too. Clay jars, woven baskets, and reed sacks stored grain, water, and tools. They were fragile, prone to cracking, yet absolutely critical. Break a storage jar, and months of harvested grain might spill, attracting vermin and threatening your next meal. Household life was a constant negotiation with fragile vessels, replacing, patching, or improvising with whatever the household could muster. Cooking implements weren't much fancier. Clay pots, stone grinders, and open hearths defined meal prep. Fires weren't just heat, they were multi-purpose tools for cooking, lighting, and sometimes purification. And remember, ventilation was minimal, smoke was thick, and flames were dangerously close to everything. One wrong move, and your clay pot or woven mat was history, along with hours of labor and a chunk of your meager food supply. Repair tools also dominated household space. Hammers, mallets, owls, and basic nails or pegs were the difference between a leaking roof and a flooded hut. Mud brick walls constantly needed patching. Reed roofs required retying. Mats frayed and had to be rewoven. Every crack and gap demanded attention. Houses weren't static, they were ongoing projects, and tools were your lifeline. Even toys and learning tools were pragmatic. Children's clay figurines, miniature plows, or tiny looms weren't just for amusement. They were practice for adult responsibilities. A child could simulate herding, weaving,
or cooking safely before handling the real dangerous versions. In these homes, play was training, and toys were instruments of skill transmission. And let's not forget fire itself. Fire was the ultimate tool and the ultimate threat. It cooked your food, hardened clay, and kept away predators. But one spark could level an entire neighborhood. Managing fire, building hearths, tending flames, controlling smoke required skill passed down through observation and experience. A single mismanaged flame could undo months of labor.
Technology in these homes wasn't glamorous. It wasn't about innovation for convenience. It was innovation for survival. Every implement, from the simplest grinding stone to the tallest ladder supporting a reed roof, was tested against necessity. The human body was the power source, ingenuity was the multiplier, and the fragile materials of mud, straw, and reeds were both ally and nemesis. So when you imagine the interior of one of these homes, don't picture emptiness. Think of tools stacked, leaned, and stored around every corner. Each carried its own story. A grinding stone shaped by generations, a knife nicked by decades of food prep, a pot patched multiple times because it was too vital to discard. These implements didn't just aid survival, they defined it. Without them, the day-to-day rhythm inside these walls would collapse. And here's the thing, mastering these tools wasn't optional. Children, adults, men, women, all had to learn and adapt. One slip, one misuse, and the consequences were immediate. Spoiled food, broken walls, injured bodies, lost crops. Your home may have seemed humble, but it was a workshop, a training ground, and a battleground for mastery of technology, all rolled into one.
Step back into the smoky interior of a mud brick home, and one thing is immediately clear. Clothing wasn't a fashion statement, it was armor. Protection against sun, cold, insects, and abrasion was the priority, and every household had to produce, maintain, and improvise with textiles in endless cycles. Start with materials. Wool, flax, linen, and reeds formed the backbone of everyday garments. Cotton existed, but it was rare and expensive. Wool came from goats or sheep. Flax was cultivated and processed painstakingly. Transforming raw fibers into usable threads required hours of labor, spinning, twisting, and weaving by hand. Mistakes meant weak cloth that ripped under stress. Every stitch counted. Weaving took center stage. Most homes contained simple looms, sometimes little more than a frame tied between posts. Women, and occasionally children, spent hours bending over threads, interlacing warp and weft until mats, garments, or simple blankets emerged. It was painstaking, repetitive work, but without it, survival was impossible. Thread shortages, broken warp, or frayed mats weren't minor inconveniences. They were threats to warmth, hygiene, and even social standing. Clothing itself was functional. Tunics, skirts, robes, and cloaks covered the body while allowing movement for labor. Layers helped regulate temperature. Light linen in blazing sun, wool over limbs during winter chills. Footwear varied widely, from sandals made of woven reeds or leather to bare feet in some households, but all were fragile. Step on a thorn, slip in mud, and the resulting injury could be disastrous, especially when medical care was rudimentary.
Households also had to contend with repair constantly. Tearing, fraying, and patching were normal. A woven patch wasn't just cosmetic. It preserved the integrity of the garment and the health of the wearer. Clothing wasn't disposable. It was a long-term investment stitched together by sweat, patience, and experience. And then there was protection against insects. Mosquitoes, fleas, and bedbugs weren't just nuisances. They spread disease. Clothing often doubled as a barrier, layering over skin where possible. In some areas, the choice of fibers, dyes, or oils applied to fabrics provided rudimentary defense. Household ingenuity meant repurposing scraps, layering mats, or tying threads tightly to reduce exposure to the endless swarm of pests. Children learned these skills early. They watched mothers mend, spin, and weave. They practiced on small scraps, slowly mastering techniques that would keep them warm, clothed, and socially acceptable in adulthood. By the time a child reached adolescence, weaving, mending, and basic clothing construction were essential survival skills. Missteps weren't tolerated. Worn-out garments meant exposure to cold, sunburn, or insect-borne disease. Storage of textiles was another art form. Woven mats, clothing, and blankets were folded or stacked in corners, protected from moisture, pests, and dust. Reed walls absorbed humidity, mud floors collected condensation, so keeping fabrics dry and clean required constant vigilance. Every household had to invent storage solutions, hanging cloth from beams, layering mats, or placing items near the hearth for warmth. Improvisation was part of survival. Even ceremonial clothing carried importance. Festivals, rituals, or sacrifices demanded special attire, sometimes rare fabrics, dyed or embroidered. These garments weren't daily wear. They were statements of status, piety, or respect. Maintaining them inside smoky, insect-filled homes was a delicate balance. Protect what was valuable while continuing the grind of everyday life. In essence, mud brick and reed homes were both textile factories and living closets. The interior space constantly buzzed with spinning, weaving, mending, and layering. Comfort was relative. Warmth was temporary. Clothing was never just decorative. It was survival, culture, and labor, all stitched together in one fragile, cramped environment. And here's the irony. These same walls that trapped smoke and smell also preserved generations of textile knowledge. Every mat, cloak, and patch carried the imprint of countless hands, lessons, and ingenuity. The home wasn't just shelter, it was a loom for life itself.
Inside a mud brick or reed home, food storage wasn't just practical, it was existential. Every grain jar, clay pot, and woven basket represented months of labor, and failure to protect those precious resources could mean hunger or worse. Grain storage dominated household strategy. Barley, wheat, emmer, and millet were typically kept in clay jars or reed baskets. The challenge? Humidity, insects, and rodents. Mud brick walls absorbed moisture from the air, and even a minor leak could send a jar's contents molding overnight. Beetles, weevils, and other pests were relentless, turning carefully harvested grain into tiny tunnels of destruction. Families often layered grain with ash or sand to slow infestations, or tied woven sacks tightly to deter hungry insects. Survival was as much about clever packaging as hard work in the fields.
Water storage carried equal importance. Clean water was scarce, so households collected from rivers, wells, or seasonal rainfall. Clay jars and reed baskets lined with pitch were common solutions, but leaks, cracks, and contamination lurked constantly. Water could become cloudy, brackish, or outright deadly if stored too long. Often, families turned to fermented drinks, weak beer, or porridge as a safer alternative. Hydration wasn't guaranteed. It was managed carefully, rationed, and sometimes gambled. Food preservation was an art and a necessity. Smoking meat, drying fish, or sun-drying grains extended edibility, but only marginally. Salt was a prized commodity where available, used sparingly to prevent spoilage. Pickling with vinegar or fermented liquids appeared in some regions. The goal was simple: stretch every morsel as far as possible, because scarcity wasn't hypothetical, it was an everyday threat.
Household pests didn't just nibble, they multiplied, infesting every corner. Rodents were cunning, persistent, and relentless. Rats could chew through reed walls or baskets, gnawing at grain stores and causing panic when discovered. Fleas and lice hopped from humans to animals and back again, while insects consumed stored legumes and dried fish. Keeping the food safe required vigilance, constant inspection, and improvisation. Hanging baskets, layering ash, or even moving stores to higher platforms where pests struggled to reach. Seasonal changes added another layer of challenge. Rainy seasons increased humidity, raising the risk of mold and fungal growth. Hot, dry seasons caused grains to crack or become brittle, and flies swarmed around any exposed scraps. Families had to anticipate these cycles, adjusting storage practices accordingly. Every jar, basket, and clay vessel was a calculated gamble against time and nature.
Children often became junior food inspectors. They were trained to spot mold, weigh jars, check lids, and report infestations. Involving them early wasn't optional, it was essential. A missed infestation could threaten the family's survival, so apprenticeship in storage and preservation started as soon as children could carry a basket without spilling it. Ritual also intertwined with storage practices. Offerings to household gods, crumbs, first grains, or small portions of beer were made near storage areas. Why? Beyond devotion, it was symbolic. You were protecting the remainder of your food through spiritual favor. Superstition wasn't mere belief, it was a form of psychological insurance in a world where failure carried real consequences.
Even when stored carefully, food was never guaranteed. Spoiled batches, flood-damaged stores, or locust invasions could wipe out months of labor in a single event. Every household had contingency strategies, storing multiple types of grain, sharing with neighbors in exchange for protection, or consuming small amounts immediately to avoid loss. Survival was a daily negotiation between abundance and scarcity. In short, mud brick and reed homes weren't just shelters, they were fortresses for food. Every jar, basket, and storage nook was an active battlefield. The fight against pests, rot, and spoilage never ended, and household life revolved around this struggle. Eat too fast, and you risk famine. Store too carelessly, and you risk disaster. Every meal, every grain, every sip of water carried the weight of months of toil.
Inside those humble mud brick walls, life wasn't just about labor and survival. It was suffused with the unseen. Religion, superstition, and ritual weren't occasional events. They were woven into the very fabric of everyday life, guiding behavior, enforcing order, and offering hope in a precarious world. Household gods or spirits were everywhere. Corners of huts often held small altars or niches where offerings were made. Crumbs of bread, a sip of beer, clay figurines, or tiny bundles of herbs. These weren't just decorative. Families believed that spirits protected their hearth, crops, and health. Neglecting them wasn't just disrespectful, it was dangerous. One misstep, one forgotten ritual, and calamity could strike. Spoiled grain, sick animals, or illness among the family.
Daily rituals were subtle but pervasive. Lighting the hearth in the morning wasn't merely for cooking, it was an act of devotion. Stirring a pot might involve a quiet prayer for fertility, harvest, or health. Sweeping floors and patching walls carried symbolic weight too, keeping evil spirits at bay along with dust and vermin. Every chore could double as a spiritual act, turning labor into a dialogue with the unseen. Superstition guided timing and decision-making. Certain days were auspicious for planting, harvesting, or baking bread. Others were dangerous, where cutting grain or handling animals could bring misfortune. Elders interpreted these signs, guiding family actions. To ignore them wasn't just folly, it was considered inviting disaster.
Children absorbed these practices naturally. Observing elders, they learned which rituals mattered, how to make offerings, and how to navigate a world where unseen forces were as real as the sun and soil. Play often mimicked ritual, tossing miniature offerings, blessing small figurines, or imitating prayers. These early lessons prepared them for adult life, ensuring continuity of belief and practice. Even sickness and healing were steeped in ritual. Herbs and poultices were common, but remedies often included prayers, chants, or symbolic gestures. A wound might be dressed with clay, but a whispered charm could protect the patient from malevolent spirits. Illness wasn't purely physical. It was both a bodily and spiritual challenge, and treatments addressed both realms simultaneously.
Fertility, birth, and death carried heightened ritual significance. Birthing mats were blessed or surrounded by protective charms. Naming a child involved prayers, offerings, and sometimes symbolic gestures designed to ensure a long life. Death, likewise, was marked with rites that connected the living with the spirits of ancestors. Even in the tight confines of a mud brick home, the cycle of life and death was inseparable from ritual practice. Household festivals amplified these spiritual currents. Harvests, seasonal changes, and religious holidays transformed daily chores into ceremonies. Food was prepared not only for sustenance, but as offerings to gods and spirits. Music, dance, and communal prayers punctuated life, reminding families that survival was not only about strength and skill, but also favor from forces beyond their control.
The impact was profound. Religion and superstition created structure in an otherwise unpredictable world. They reinforced hierarchy and cooperation, encouraged careful observation of the environment, and offered psychological comfort amid relentless labor and uncertainty. The walls of the home absorbed more than smoke. They absorbed prayers, chants, and the rituals of generations, making the house both a physical shelter and a spiritual sanctuary. And the irony? The very homes that trapped smoke, sweat, and pests also contained the sacred. Mud and reed, though humble, held the invisible threads that connected families to the divine, to the spirits of the land, and to the ancestors. Life inside these walls
was brutal, exhausting, and dangerous, but it was also deeply purposeful, governed by a constant awareness that survival depended not just on skill and labor, but on reverence and ritual.
Step inside, and you quickly realize that a mud brick or reed home was more than a shelter. It was a microcosm of society. Hierarchy wasn't abstract, it was lived, breathed, and enforced daily. Every corner, every hearth, every chore reinforced a delicate web of authority, obligation, and expectation. At the top of the household hierarchy were usually the men who controlled fields, tools, or livestock. Their decisions dictated work schedules, resource allocation, and sometimes even family discipline. But authority was not absolute. Women wielded their own influence through labor, knowledge, and control over domestic resources. The person who ground the grain or brewed the beer held invisible power, because without food, no one thrived.
Women's roles were simultaneously constrained and indispensable. Cooking, weaving, childcare, and tending small livestock consumed hours each day. Yet within that labor lay subtle authority, controlling portions of food, managing storage, instructing children, maintaining domestic order. A matriarch could subtly dictate household routines, prioritize tasks, and influence outcomes simply through her mastery of everyday operations. Children, meanwhile, navigated hierarchy as apprentices. They learned who to defer to, whose orders to follow, and when to assert themselves. Missteps weren't just scolded, they could have tangible consequences, like wasted food, injured animals, or delayed work. Sibling rivalries often mirrored adult social dynamics, preparing the young for a lifetime of negotiation, cooperation, and survival under pressure.
Elders commanded respect through memory and experience. Their influence was both practical and moral. They remembered past famines, floods, and conflicts, and their advice shaped labor strategies, ritual practices, and even conflict resolution. Challenging an elder wasn't just socially unacceptable, it was risky. Their knowledge could literally mean the difference between survival and disaster. And conflict? It happened, frequently. Crowded spaces, scarce resources, and constant labor made tempers short. Arguments flared over food portions, task assignments, or minor slights. Violence sometimes erupted. Archaeological evidence shows skeletal injuries consistent with domestic disputes. Yet conflict was balanced by cooperation. Without it, the household would collapse. Negotiation and compromise were daily survival tools.
Gender roles were strict but fluid in emergencies. Men handled heavy field labor, hunting, or major repairs. Women managed domestic chores and small-scale production. Yet, in crises, floods, illness, famine,
roles blurred. Women might repair tools or tend livestock. Men might grind grain or prepare food. Survival overrode convention, revealing adaptability hidden beneath rigid social structures. Social hierarchy extended beyond the family. Visiting neighbors, extended kin, or tradespeople introduced new power dynamics. Who got first share of food? Who controlled access to stored grain or water? Who could borrow tools or labor? Your home wasn't just a private space, it was a node in a network of mutual dependence, negotiation, and social signaling.
Even rituals and religious duties reinforced hierarchy. Elders or male heads often led prayers or made offerings, while women and children performed subordinate but essential tasks. Participation was mandatory. Refusal could bring social shame or perceived spiritual consequences. The household became both a school of survival and a stage for social performance. In essence, the walls of a mud brick home contained more than bodies. They contained power, knowledge, and influence. Survival depended on everyone understanding their place, respecting roles, and navigating tensions. Cooperation wasn't optional. It was encoded into daily labor, ritual, and interaction.
And yet, within this rigid structure, small rebellions and negotiations thrived. Children tricked each other, siblings competed for privileges, women bargained over work tasks, and even men adjusted routines based on circumstance. Life inside the home was a constant dance between authority and negotiation, rigidity and adaptability. So when you picture life inside a humble mud brick or reed hut, think beyond bricks and smoke. It was a dense, dynamic social arena where every action mattered. Every voice, loud or quiet, had weight, and survival required both obedience and cunning.
Inside these humble walls, illness was an ever-present shadow. Disease didn't knock politely, it struck suddenly, indiscriminately, and often fatally. There were no doctors, no sterile bandages, no antibiotics. The household itself became the primary site of care, improvisation, and desperate hope. First, prevention. Families understood hygiene in practical terms. Sweeping floors, separating spoiled food, boiling water when possible. But knowledge was limited. People relied on observation, superstition, and trial and error. Avoid certain plants, respect omens, and don't overwork children or the sick. It wasn't science as we know it, but survival demanded rules of thumb.
When illness struck, remedies were as creative as they were rudimentary. Herbal poultices treated wounds. Honey was applied for its antibacterial properties. Clay sometimes wrapped injuries to reduce infection. Children watched and learned early, absorbing this knowledge as part of daily life. Mistakes were painful teachers, but they ensured the next generation knew which herbs could soothe a fever, which leaves could reduce swelling, and which rituals might protect against malevolent spirits. Sickness often dictated the household rhythm. A sick adult or child disrupted chores, meal prep, and labor schedules. Sometimes multiple members became ill simultaneously, leaving households stretched dangerously thin. Those who were well had to labor for the whole family, grinding grain, tending animals, and repairing structures, all while keeping the sick alive. There was no respite. Illness amplified the relentless daily grind.
Spiritual remedies were inseparable from physical ones. Offerings, charms, prayers, and protective amulets were used alongside herbal treatments. The unseen world was believed to influence recovery. Neglecting ritual could worsen disease. Magic, faith, and medicine blended, creating a system that addressed both body and spirit, even if its efficacy was limited. Minor injuries were routine: cuts from knives or flint, bruises from plowing or herding, burns from open fires. Quick care could prevent disaster, but serious trauma, broken bones, infections, or snake bites was often fatal. The home became an infirmary, filled with whispered instructions, crude bandages, and constant vigilance. Sleeping arrangements might be adjusted to keep the sick near warmth and observation, with children or caregivers taking turns tending to them through the night.
Even preventative measures were intertwined with household labor. Sweeping floors, patching cracks in walls, and keeping food sealed weren't just chores, they were defenses against vermin, disease, and spoilage. Every action contributed to the survival of bodies vulnerable to infection and injury. Mortality was visible and immediate. Skeletal remains reveal high rates of childhood death, malnutrition, and disease-related deformities. Families lived with constant awareness that life was fragile. Grief was private but persistent, often addressed within the household rather than through formalized mourning outside.
Yet there was resilience. Knowledge accumulated over generations allowed households to mitigate some risks. Herbal lore, observation of symptoms, and practical experience created a survival toolkit. Children absorbed this knowledge early, ensuring continuity. The home was not only a site of labor and shelter, it was also a clinic, pharmacy, and school of survival, all under one roof. So imagine it: a child with a fever, a parent applying a poultice, smoke curling from the hearth, and whispered prayers floating through the dim air. The home was suffused with danger, but also with the ingenuity, determination, and knowledge that kept people alive, day after relentless day. It might surprise you, but even in smoke-filled, cramped, labor-intensive mud brick and reed homes, people found ways to relax, entertain themselves, and strengthen social bonds. Leisure wasn't abundant, but it was vital.
a pressure valve in a world defined by toil. Storytelling was king. Around the hearth, families passed down myths, histories, and cautionary tales. Children sat wide-eyed, absorbing lessons about survival, morality, and social norms. Elders wove stories of past harvests, heroic ancestors, or misadventures that ended in disaster or laughter. These narratives weren't just entertainment, they were education, strategy, and moral instruction rolled into one. A misstep in the tale might mirror a danger in the field, reinforcing lessons in a memorable, often dramatic way.
Games and play were surprisingly creative. Children improvised toys from scraps, clay figurines, small sticks, or leftover thread, and staged mock hunts, herding exercises, or battles. Even adults joined, if only briefly, in light-hearted competitions, tossing pebbles, rolling balls, or racing around the courtyard. Play sharpened reflexes, coordination, and observation, skills crucial for labor, hunting, and defense. Leisure doubled as practical training. Music and rhythm filled the air when possible. Drums, rattles, or simple flutes made from reeds accompanied celebrations, storytelling, or rituals. Work itself sometimes had a rhythmical aspect. Grinding grain, pounding clay, weaving mats, which could be synchronized with chants or songs. These patterns created a shared tempo, easing monotony and fostering communal spirit.
Feasts and communal meals were highlights. Even modest households celebrated small victories: a successful harvest, a healthy birth, or a repaired roof. Food, scarce as it often was, became a medium for social bonding. Sharing what little was available reinforced trust, hierarchy, and cooperation. Every bite was more than sustenance. It was connection, celebration, and affirmation of survival. Humor was essential. Sarcasm, teasing, and playful rivalry kept spirits alive. Children taunted each other, siblings competed for attention, and even adults cracked jokes amid chores. Humor functioned as social glue, easing tension and reminding everyone that even in hardship, life could be endured with a spark of levity.
Ritual and leisure often intertwined. Festivals, seasonal observances, or religious holidays created structured breaks from labor. Singing, dancing, and offerings marked the rhythm of life, and participation was both spiritual and recreational. The line between devotion and entertainment blurred, making even religious observance a source of communal enjoyment. Animals contributed too. Pets, or at least domesticated companions, offered distraction and amusement. Goats, chickens, or dogs provided moments of play and interaction. Herding, feeding, or simply watching animals could be entertaining, teaching responsibility and coordination while offering relief from human labor.
And sometimes the simplest acts were the most cherished.
sitting quietly by the fire, feeling warmth on your back, watching smoke curl toward the ceiling, listening to family chatter, or counting stars through roof gaps. These small moments provided psychological respite, reinforcing resilience in a physically and socially demanding environment. So while mud brick and reed homes were never luxurious and life was far from leisurely, people created spaces for joy, humor, and connection. Entertainment was woven into survival. Leisure reinforced skill, hierarchy, and cooperation. In a home dominated by labor, moments of play, story, music, and laughter were not frivolous. They were essential to enduring the relentless grind.
Life inside a mud brick or reed home didn't exist in isolation. Houses clustered close together, sharing walls, water sources, and fields. Every household was embedded in a broader network of neighbors, kin, and extended family. And navigating this web required tact, negotiation, and sometimes sheer cunning.
Conflicts were inevitable. Crowded spaces, scarce resources, and overlapping responsibilities created tension. Disputes over water usage, grazing rights, shared labor, or even noise could flare into arguments, or worse, physical confrontations. A broken fence, a trampled field, or a mismanaged communal tool could spark heated exchanges. The home wasn't just a domestic space, it was a front line in a constant negotiation of resources.
Resolution often relied on hierarchy and custom. Elders or respected heads of households mediated disputes, invoking precedent, ritual, or communal norms. Their authority balanced fairness with practicality, ensuring survival for all involved. Decisions weren't always impartial, but they were accepted because the alternative, ongoing conflict or social ostracism, was far worse.
Kinship played a crucial role. Extended families formed networks of mutual obligation. Borrowed tools had to be returned. Favors were tracked. Debts in grain, labor, or protection were remembered. A mud brick home didn't just shelter a nuclear family. It acted as a node in a wider social ledger. Failure to honor obligations could isolate a household, reduce access to communal resources, or invite retaliation. Community gatherings were both social and strategic. Collective labor, repairing irrigation canals, building storage structures, or rethatching roofs relied on coordination among households. These events reinforced social bonds, clarified responsibilities, and maintained goodwill. Participation wasn't optional. Skipping communal work could bring both social and practical penalties.
Cooperation was enforced not by law, but by survival logic and communal pressure. Neighborly interactions extended into trade and resource sharing. Grain, water, firewood, tools, and labor were exchanged in a delicate balance. Bartering relied on trust, observation, and reputation. A household known for generosity might receive aid in times of crisis. One known for hoarding could be shunned or cut off. Every interaction carried weight, and every decision, who to help, what to lend, was a calculated risk in the survival game.
Ritual and social norms intertwined. Festivals, seasonal rites, or religious observances created structured opportunities for negotiation, conflict resolution, and strengthening alliances. A shared meal or communal offering could mend fences after disputes, while public rituals reinforced hierarchy and moral expectations. In essence, culture was the lubricant for daily social friction.
Even within a single home, community rules shaped behavior. Children learned early that misbehavior could have repercussions, not just within the household, but in wider kinship networks. Siblings, cousins, and visiting children were constantly assessed against communal norms, reinforcing social learning from the inside out.
Interestingly, tension and resolution weren't always negative. Negotiation fostered skill, cunning, and resilience. Families learned to read intentions, anticipate reactions, and navigate complex webs of obligation. The very act of living in close quarters, sharing resources, and maintaining relationships honed survival instincts as much as farming or cooking ever could.
In short, mud brick and reed homes were not isolated fortresses. They were nodes in living networks of cooperation, competition, and negotiation. The walls contained labor, life, and ritual, but they also witnessed subtle diplomacy, conflict, and resolution. Survival required mastering not only chores, but relationships, inside the household, with neighbors, and across the social web of the community.
Inside a mud brick or reed home, life was anything but static. Seasons ruled, and households adapted their routines, labor, and even social behavior to the relentless march of environmental cycles. Survival depended on reading the land, the skies, and the calendar with almost ritual precision.
Spring brought a burst of activity. Fields needed planting, water channels repaired, and animal births tended. Inside the home, preparations were just as intense. Grain stores were inspected, tools sharpened, and textiles mended for the coming months. Smoke from hearth fires carried not just warmth, but the scent of early bread baking, porridge, and occasionally offerings to household spirits requesting a bountiful season. Summer introduced extremes, scorching heat,
long days and relentless labor. Mud brick walls absorbed the sun's intensity, making interiors sweltering. Families adapted by shifting tasks to cooler parts of the day. Early mornings for fieldwork, midday for indoor chores, evenings for communal gatherings or repair work. Water became precious. Wells were checked, containers filled, and children learned to ration. Even clothing and bedding were adapted. Lighter garments, mats moved to catch evening breezes, rooftops occasionally used for sleeping under stars.
Autumn was the harvest season, a time of high stress and opportunity. Grain, legumes, and fruits were collected, dried, and stored. Clay jars and reed baskets were inspected, patched, and reinforced. Food preservation took center stage because a failed harvest meant months of hunger. Inside the home, the rhythm was frenetic, pounding, grinding, cooking, and storing, often from dawn to dusk, with little respite. And all this labor was paired with ritual, Thanksgiving offerings, prayers for protection, and small communal feasts when possible.
Winter, in contrast, was a season of endurance. Cold walls, limited daylight, and reduced outdoor labor forced families to concentrate on indoor survival. Hearth fires burned nearly constantly, providing warmth, cooking, and light. Households focused on repairing roofs, reinforcing mud walls, and maintaining tools for the next cycle. Clothing and bedding were layered meticulously, and rationing food became essential. Children learned indoor tasks, spinning, weaving, mending, storytelling, as preparation for spring's return.
Festivals and religious observances punctuated these cycles. Seasonal holidays marked planting, harvest, or solstices. Homes became centers of ritual, altars adorned, offerings made, and neighbors invited to share in symbolic acts. These occasions broke the monotony of labor, reinforced social cohesion, and connected households to the wider spiritual and environmental order.
Environmental pressures also dictated improvisation. Flooding could sweep away stored grain. Drought could empty water containers. Unexpected storms damaged roofs and walls. Every season demanded adaptability. Families learned to anticipate threats, moving supplies, reinforcing walls, adjusting labor schedules, or improvising new solutions for water collection and storage. Survival wasn't just a daily grind. It was a cycle of prediction, preparation, and rapid response.
Children and apprentices absorbed these rhythms naturally. They learned which months demanded hard field labor, which chores shifted indoors,
and how rituals marked seasonal transitions. By adolescence, a young person could read the calendar as instinctively as adults, knowing when to plant, harvest, repair, or rest. Seasonal cycles weren't abstract. They were encoded into every household routine, chore, and ritual. In essence, mud brick and reed homes were living with the seasons. Walls trapped heat in summer and cold in winter. Roofs channeled water in rains. Storage areas shifted with crop yields. Life inside was a continuous negotiation with the environment, dictated by weather, daylight, and seasonal festivals. These homes were not just shelters, they were adaptive machines finely tuned to the pulse of the natural world.
So here we are, standing, or rather imagining standing, inside the quiet aftermath of a day in a mud brick or reed home. The fire has dimmed, the mats are worn, the grain jars are full, or at least as full as survival allows, and the house hums with the muted echo of a family that has endured yet another cycle of toil, ritual, and adaptation. What strikes you, if you pay attention, isn't just the hardship, it's ingenuity, it's resilience. It's the relentless human capacity to transform mud, straw, and sweat into a living, breathing ecosystem of survival. Every tool, every mat, every woven thread, every grain jar, every ritual acted like a gear in a vast self-sustaining machine. And the people? They were both operators and designers, constantly adjusting, improvising, and learning.
Consider the sheer economy of knowledge packed into those walls. Children learned the arts of weaving, mending, grinding, cooking, herding, and ritual, all before they even reached adolescence. Apprenticeship wasn't optional. It was the lifeblood of survival. Adults juggled endless labor with social negotiation, spiritual practice, and maintaining fragile infrastructure, all while anticipating the whims of weather, pests, and disease. Every decision mattered. Every failure had consequences. And yet, life persisted. The mud brick and reed home was a crucible of social, technological, and spiritual innovation. Tools, textiles, and fire were not mere conveniences. They were survival strategies honed over generations. Rituals and superstition weren't quaint beliefs. They were psychological, social, and spiritual scaffolds holding families together amid uncertainty. And social hierarchies, gender roles, and apprenticeship weren't just conventions. They were practical structures that allowed households to function efficiently under extreme constraints.
Even leisure, storytelling, music, and seasonal festivals weren't frivolous. They were lifelines. They bound families, maintained mental resilience, and passed knowledge subtly from one generation to the next. Humor, play, and ritual were not breaks from life's grind. They were integral to enduring it. Look closely, and you see that these homes were more than shelters. They were living ecosystems of human ingenuity, adaptability, and endurance.
They illustrate the raw truth of daily life in ancient times. Survival demanded creativity, cooperation, and an intimate understanding of both the environment and the human body. Modern comforts might shield us from these challenges, but the lessons remain.
What's remarkable is how much life, culture, and knowledge thrived in these confined, smoky, insect-ridden spaces. Families adapted to scarcity, fought disease, leveraged tools and textiles, balanced social hierarchy, observed the seasons, and celebrated milestones, all under one roof. Resilience wasn't optional, it was encoded into every action, ritual, and interaction. So next time you step into a comfortable home, pause for a moment and imagine life without convenience. Grinding grain with aching arms, patching walls with mud before a storm, tending sick children while smoke curls around your face, or teaching a child to weave a mat that might literally save the family's sleep. These homes, humble and fragile though they were, bore witness to the extraordinary ingenuity, determination, and perseverance of ordinary people.
In the end, mud brick and reed homes tell us a timeless story. Survival is hard, life is relentless, and yet human beings find a way to endure, adapt, and even thrive. Through labor, ritual, innovation, and social cohesion, these households achieved what modern observers might scarcely imagine: a rhythm of life that, while grueling, was astonishingly sophisticated, resilient, and enduring. The walls may have been made of mud and reeds, but the lives within them were built of determination, creativity, and the sheer stubborn will to survive. And that, perhaps, is the greatest legacy of all.